Man, I wonder how much that new Spider-Man No Way Home movie made this weekend.
That was easy.
Hello and welcome back to a brand new Quickflicks video. We haven't done one in about a month, actually. I took a bit of time off between the previous upload, which was the remastered Nostalgia Critic video, and this one. So now, just in time for Christmas, we're going to be talking about the Web Slingers' third outing in the Spider-Man Home Trilogy, once again directed by Jon Watts, confirming that this is the first director in the MCU to finish a whole trilogy. Well, that's something. This film takes place immediately following the post-credit scene of Far From Home, where the world is now exposed to the fact that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and the world thinks that he killed a very famous superhero, which, if you haven't seen Far From Home, he's not really a superhero, so there you go. And so his whole world comes crashing down, with people in his life kind of missing out on opportunities because of the connections to him. And so he thinks to himself, well, let's try to alleviate this by trying to make the entire world think that, he's not Spider-Man, by going to Doctor Strange to create an amnesia spell. And in the process of doing so, Peter Parker, being who he is, being an unsure person, he screws up the spell in various ways, leading to a bunch of rogues gallery from the cinematic history of Spider-Man's past to show up in this movie in a way that is very explosive, leading him and his friends to go and capture the remaining people that had squeaked through the spell and arrived into the MCU, leading to a film that is ultimately a very fun-filled, nostalgic run through the entirety of the cinematic history of Spider-Man. So, I had trepidation going into this film, mostly because I wasn't too sure about where this film was going. From the marketing, it seemed like it was going to be two completely different movies, with one side being the aftermath of Peter Parker's whole thing with Mysterio and being caught up in a legal case, and then the other side of it is this whole multiverse cracking open thing, and I felt like it was going to lead to a very overstuffed film, and in some ways it definitely is. Some of the ideas could have been expanded upon just a bit, but in total I did think that Spider-Man No Way Home is a pretty fun ride for the most part. As I said in my summary, it's really fun, especially when it gets to the second half of the film, where things start to get more explosive and much more entertaining, with various things happening along the way, with villains turning on each other and all this other stuff. It's crazy. It's a crazy amount of fun. And that's pretty much all I can really say to you in this spoiler-free section, because I don't want to give too much away. There's a lot of stuff about this movie that I desperately want to talk about. And in this review, since it's now the next week, I'm going to talk about spoilers, but I won't talk about them yet. I'm going to get into the stuff that I really like the most without getting into spoilers, just basic stuff off the top of my head. I think this is Tom Holland's best performance as the web slinger himself. This is his final outing in the Home trilogy, and I hear they're making a Spider-Man 4, which is just amazing to hear, and I'm excited to see where this film goes into with Peter Parker's college years, considering where the film ends by the end of the film. And it's no surprise that various actors have returned to reprise their roles, especially the villains, with Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin showing the most range in terms of a villain. He is just really great and really feels like he stepped out of the movie that he first arrived in 2002's Spider-Man. And he just picks up right where he leaves off. And it's a really cool decision for him not to really wear the mask much at all in this film, because even without the mask, he is still a creepy, creepy man that has a really iconic smile and a very scary voice. And just everything about him, the mannerisms, in fact, a lot of the villain's whole mannerisms in this movie just make sense. They feel like they've just leapt from their own cinematic universes into our own and still are playing the same characters, especially with Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin and Alfred Molina's reprised role of Dr. Octavius, which I found really awesome in this movie. I'll also say too that the third act of this movie is probably one of my favorite third acts in the entirety of the MCU, with such an iconic set piece that we have in this film that is marketed in the film pretty extensively. It's a really fun entire third act fight scene that is just imaginative and is actually a little bit different than a lot of other third acts where a lot of the times it involves a lot of people dying, and in this one it's very different, and we'll get to that in the spoiler section. And I think the final scene of this film really epitomizes how important this whole trilogy is, because it really does feel like this entire trilogy and his entire appearance in the MCU up until this point was all but an origin story for where we take the story of Peter Parker next, which, whatever they're going to do, Clone Saga, if they're ever going to adapt that, I don't think they will. But various other stories they could go into. Maybe we get introduced to Miles Morales later on, because we still haven't seen that come to fruition since 2017's Homecoming. So there's that. So now I'm going to get into the spoiler section. So if you don't want any spoilers, cut to this point in the timeline so that you don't get spoiled. So here we go. 3, 2, 1, let's go. So starting off, I want to point out one detail that I noticed that not a lot of people are really talking about, but it's something that happens to Aunt May. In the story, Aunt May unfortunately dies via a Green Goblin attack. And it's really sad, it's emotional, but one thing that this whole scene cuts to is a sewing machine. It's a sewing machine that was in the process of making something, I presume maybe a blanket or an article of clothing for one of the people at Feast, I assume. And at the end of the film, when Peter Parker is finally on his own, there's no friends for him, no Avengers, just nothing, he makes his suit with Aunt May's sewing machine. And I found that just emotional. I found that really touching, because in a way, Aunt May, even after she's gone, she's still in some way helping people, in a way that she's also helping Peter as well. Like, that is just a really nice detail that I really liked from Jon Watts. In fact, the final scene after the third act is just great. The scene with Tom Holland going into the coffee shop where MJ is working and Ned is having like a donut or something. You know, it's a nice, effective scene because it just shows how lonely Peter is at this point. Because in the finale of the third act, we see that Peter Parker chooses to accept that he has to make everyone forget that he exists. Not the fact that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, but the fact that he exists, in order to not only save the multiverse or his reality, but also for his friends to no longer be in danger, for his friends, just his family, his friends, people in his life, to no longer be in danger of being associated with him. And I feel like this is going to be a pretty interesting focal point to focus on in the next trilogy if they ever decide to make one, because, you know, it's a fresh start, but it's also a start that requires him to have a GED and possibly go to NYU. I don't know. And then we also have to talk about the cameos in this film. I think the cameos were really good. There was one that I was expecting, or at least thought I expected. There was a quote-unquote leak that Matt Murdock from the Netflix series for Daredevil would be in the movie, and I just kind of dismissed it as like, this could have been Photoshop, this could have been something else. But no, in a scene that kind of just wraps up a lot of the main drive of Far From Home's aftermath, with the threats of being taken to court over the fact that he killed Mysterio and he had the StarTech glasses and all that. I feel like the whole stuff with him in legal trouble was kind of just wrapped up pretty quickly, and they did it via Charlie Cox's Daredevil showing up and just saying, okay, well, they have to kind of drop the charges against you. You have an airtight alibi. You know, it's a nice scene. It's actually really funny. It's a really great little introduction to Daredevil. You didn't really need much to introduce Daredevil. This was like the easiest way that you could possibly do to introduce Daredevil. I really liked the scene, but it is definitely a scene that just wraps up all that little like side story into just one thing so that they can focus on the rest of it with the multiverse, with the two Spider-Men to show up, with all this other stuff. It's a lot. And now we have to also get to the two Spider-Men, of course. So Toby and Andrew showed up. I had a hard time believing that maybe they would show up, but I kind of figured by deduction that if you were supposed to be bringing in villains from other realities, then you would also have to bring their various versions of Peter Parker's as well for a final fight. And sure enough, we get that in a really awesome reveal sequence, and just them working together to take down all these villains was actually really cool. I really like the way that they all work together. Like, the thing is like, you know, Toby and Andrew had no experience working on a team or working as a team, really. And so with Tom's Peter Parker, which one is it? With Tom's Peter Parker, he has lots of experience with working as a team. And it has this whole thing where Tom is our version of Peter Parker. He's able to lead a team, but he's also a pretty decent Spider-Man. And so going back to what I was saying about the third act, the resolution of most of it, I really like how, in terms of a lot of the Spider-Man stories that we've had in the past, with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, for example, and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, there always needs to seem that the villains need to die. And in this case, Tom Holland's Peter Parker deduces that if they just cure them, then they can go back to their home and they don't have to hurt people in their timeline. It's in effect probably making branch realities of the Sam Raimi and Mark Webb universes, but that's a whole other discussion. And I really like the way that they kind of handle this. No one really had to die necessarily in order to, you know, alleviate things. I'm just going to take a second here and freeze frame myself and give you something else to think about too, is that I did mess up in saying that all the characters died. No, Dr. Connors is technically the only Spider-Man villain to be cured of what he had. So, yeah, there goes my dumb brain. Anyway, back to the review. And that's actually really nice, and it gets to the heart of who Peter is. He doesn't want to kill people. He shouldn't want to kill people. He wants to resolve things in such a peaceful manner, or even in a manner that, you know, reduces the pain of those who are suffering and those, you know, that need help. He's there to help. He's a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And what way to do it than to help cure these people? And I really like the scene where, you know, Tom Holland is in the condo that Happy owns, and he devises a machine or a little tiny thing to put on Doc Ock's neck that helps him gain controls of his arms that had taken control of him. And it's actually a really nice scene. I really enjoy that. And so the final battle, in a sense, is not necessarily about punching the bad guys or taking them down or destroying them. It's more about curing them. And I really like that aspect. And it really shows how much Aunt May had an effect on him, especially when she was doing Feast. Now, granted, I do still hold the opinion that Aunt May in this universe didn't get enough screen time with Feast. I would have liked a little bit more, because something that the PS4 game does really well is that you spend certain points in that game going to Feast and seeing the effect that Feast has had with a lot of people, right? But we barely see a lot of that in this movie. We barely see anything involving her helping people, aside from Norman Osborn in this movie. She barely is shown to be helping people. Whereas in the Spider-Man PS4 game, she's shown a lot. You know, she's helping make food for everyone at Feast. She's handing out blankets. She's trying to manage the center during the outbreak that happens in that game. And this movie, as well as the other movies, don't really make use of the fact that Aunt May is a person that's a helping person. And that is something that I kind of hold against this movie just a little bit. But it's still all the more effective when her death happens in this movie, which leads to probably my favorite scene in this entire thing. Aside from the memory wipe scene that happens later on, the scene where Toby and Andrew and Tom discuss grief is actually really healthy and is really nice and positive. And I think we need more of this, possibly. Like, each of these versions have very different yet similar qualities to each other, and it really illustrates how these variants or how these different versions of Peter Parker are essentially the same in certain ways. Because for each of them, they all have something that they regret, or at least someone that they lost. And for Toby, it was his uncle, and he had to go down and he had to hunt down and kill the guy that he thought killed his uncle, when in fact he killed an innocent man, and it was Flint Marko Sandman. And even then, in Spider-Man 3, all was forgiven, and it was really nice. For Andrew Garfield, it was, well, unfortunately, snapping the back of Gwen Stacy by accident. He didn't realize how fast she was going, and, that happened. And for him, he just didn't hold back the punches, and it was terrible for him. And so with Tom, he desperately wants to kill the Green Goblin, which leads to a very awesome scene towards the end of the third act climax, where he's about to kill Green Goblin with his own lighter in a almost similar fashion to Spider-Man 1. But then Toby is like, hey, remember what we taught you. Without having to say it, it's more of like, this sort of warm, gentle look. This sort of, hey, we talked about this, bro. We talked about this. Now, granted, he ends up getting his back stabbed by Green Goblin, which didn't really kill him. Which is kind of surprising, because I was like, okay, well, he's going to die. No, they didn't, which is actually kind of surprising. I'm interested to see where this goes, if they ever continue it. Maybe Secret Wars, maybe Spider-Verse, I don't know. But for the most part, I really like the character dynamics, again, of all three of the Spider-Man in this movie. Now, there's plenty of other things I could really talk about in this movie, but for the most part, again, in summary, I really liked Spider-Man No Way Home. It is probably my third favorite Spider-Man film, behind Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man 2 on my Letterboxd ranking. It could change at any time. I would love to watch this movie again to really judge what I really like about the movie, but for the most part, I really have enjoyed this movie. And I waited until my mom and my brother got to go see it tonight, actually. I'm recording on Sunday, and this is going to be up on Monday, so it's going to be for you guys. Yeah. So yeah, in all sense of the word, I think Spider-Man No Way Home is spectacular. It's probably in my top 10 favorite MCU films, probably not top 5 yet. I still need to reevaluate the entire franchise, which is going to take me a long time. But I think No Way Home is a pretty good, solid conclusion to an otherwise very mishmashy type of trilogy that, all in all, works to be a pretty interesting 3-film origin story, which is just kind of weird to say, but it happens. So yeah, I'm going to give Spider-Man No Way Home an A-. Despite my flaws with the film, it still is overall entertaining. Even with flaws and all, it's still entertaining to me. Now, I get why some people will not like the nostalgia in this film, that it's just too nostalgic heavy and it's too distracting, but I think for this film, I think it just works. I think it works. To really solidify the true origin of this version of Peter Parker, I think it just works. So yeah, that's what I thought about Spider-Man No Way Home. So thank you guys so much for watching my review of this movie. Just as a quick heads up before I let you guys go, this week I was supposed to do a Christmas review, but I decided to do something a little bit different for this Saturday. So I will be putting up a video essay that day, something that's a little bit different than what I'm used to, but it's a film essay about something I'm pretty passionate about when it comes to a certain Christmas movie. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You're just going to have to trust me and tune in on Christmas morning. Hopefully I get it out by then, but I do want to get it there in time. So, yeah. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next review. Peace.